Horus was the Emperor's favorite son. Out of the 20 Primarchs, those superpowered warrior leaders the Emperor had scattered across the stars, Horus stood above the rest. He was charming where others were aloof, brave where others hesitated, and incredibly talented in both battle and leadership, where others excelled in only one domain. Wherever Horus went, victory followed like a faithful hound. Where his brothers left conquered worlds smoldering, Horus left them celebrating. Where others ruled through fear, Horus commanded through love. Because of his brilliance and the deep affection the Emperor held for him, Horus was made War Master, the supreme commander of all the Emperor's armies. No one else had that title. No one else was trusted with so much power. While his brothers commanded single legions, Horus commanded them all. While they answered to the Emperor, entire sectors of the galaxy answered to Horus. At first, this elevation filled Horus with honor and purpose. He saw the title not as a prize to be won, but as a sacred duty to be fulfilled. He wanted nothing more than to make his father proud, to unite the galaxy in peace and order, to be worthy of the trust placed in him. He led crusade after crusade with unprecedented success, conquering worlds that had resisted for millennia, building alliances where others had found only enemies, and earning not just the obedience but the genuine respect of his brothers. But beneath this golden exterior, there was a problem brewing, a crack in the foundation that would eventually bring down the entire structure. Horus, for all his superhuman strength and tactical genius, possessed a deeply human flaw. He needed constant affirmation. He needed to feel like the most important person in the Emperor's life, not just as a general, but as a son. This need wasn't born of mere vanity, it came from a place of genuine love and devotion. He worshipped his father with the pure heart of a child, even while commanding the deaths of millions with the cold calculation of a warlord. When the Emperor suddenly returned to Earth and left Horus in charge of the Great Crusade, he didn't explain why. To everyone else, this seemed like the ultimate expression of trust. The Emperor was so confident in Horus that he could leave the entire galactic conquest in his hands. But to Horus, the Emperor's departure felt like abandonment. The silence stung worse than any wound. He needed answers, explanations, reassurance that he was still loved. Instead, the Emperor gave him responsibilities and walked away. Then came the disaster that changed everything. On what should have been a routine compliance mission, Horus was gravely injured by a weapon infused with chaos energy. His fellow Space Marines, desperate to save their beloved War Master, took him to the only healers available. But these weren't the kind of healers you'd want touching anyone you loved. These were the Sons of the Serpent, secret worshippers of the dark gods of chaos, practitioners of arts that could heal the body while poisoning the soul. They didn't just mend his wounds, they infected his mind with doubt and rage. While Horus lay dying, they whispered lies into his soul, planting seeds in the fertile ground of his existing insecurities. They told him his father had never truly loved him, that he had only been a useful tool in a larger plan. They showed him twisted visions of a future where the Emperor ascended to godhood and abandoned all his sons, casting them aside like broken weapons once the war was won. And the most damaging lie of all? Horus believed them. The wounds in his heart, which had been carefully hidden beneath layers of duty and devotion, suddenly reopened and began to fester. All the doubts he had buried, all the anger he had suppressed, came flooding out like poison from a lanced wound. He began to see his brothers not as family to be protected, but as rivals to be defeated. He saw the Emperor's great dream of human unity not as a noble cause, but as a lie designed to mask selfish ambition. In this poisoned state of mind, consumed by feelings of betrayal and abandonment, Horus turned on the father he had once adored. But he didn't turn alone. Wounded animals are often the most dangerous, and Horus used his charisma and influence to wound others, as he had been wounded. He whispered carefully chosen words into the ears of his brothers, those who also felt hurt, betrayed, forgotten, or undervalued. He knew exactly what each of them needed to hear, what fears to exploit, what resentments to nurture. One by one, some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy followed him down the path of damnation. This betrayal sparked the Horus Heresy, a civil war so massive and destructive that it shattered empires, burned entire star systems, and left scars on the galaxy that would never fully heal. Because Horus was the first to fall, the golden son who had stood highest in his father's favor, he became the natural leader of the rebellion. His fall was driven not by ambition or evil, but by heartbreak, pride, and the terrible, gnawing weight of feeling unloved by the one person whose opinion mattered most. The tragedy of Horus is that he got exactly what he thought he wanted, his father's full attention. But by the time he had it, it came in the form of the Emperor's sword, piercing his chest aboard a battle barge above Terra, as father and son destroyed each other in the final, apocalyptic confrontation of their war. Where Horus was a warrior first and a philosopher second, Lorgar was the opposite. A thinker, a writer, and a preacher who happened to command one of the most powerful military forces in the galaxy. He wasn't obsessed with swords or battles like Angron, or with perfection like Fulgrim. Instead, Lorgar was consumed by questions of meaning, purpose, and the divine nature of existence. To Lorgar, the Emperor wasn't just a powerful leader or even a father figure, he was quite literally a god walking among mortals, a divine being wearing human form. Where his brothers saw their father as the pinnacle of human achievement, Lorgar saw something transcendent, something worthy not just of obedience, but of worship. This wasn't mere hero worship, it was genuine religious devotion, pure and absolute. So while other Primarchs built monuments to military victories, Lorgar began constructing shrines, temples, and soaring cathedrals to honor his father's divinity. He commanded his legion, the Word-Bearers, to spread faith across the stars rather than just conquest. Where others left behind compliant worlds, Lorgar left behind converts. He wrote holy books filled with devotion and poetry, theological treatises that explored the Emperor's divine nature, and liturgies that helped millions find meaning in their submission to the Imperium. And for a time, it worked beautifully. Entire populations bowed in worship, finding comfort and purpose in the faith Lorgar had given them. His worlds were among the most peaceful and productive in the growing Imperium, held together not by fear, but by shared belief. But the Emperor didn't want to be seen as a god. In fact, he actively rejected all forms of religious devotion. To the Emperor, Lorgar's faith represented everything he was trying to eliminate from human culture: superstition, irrationality, the surrender of human agency to supernatural forces. But to Lorgar, this rejection was utterly devastating. Imagine spending your entire existence telling everyone how amazing your father is, building your entire identity around celebrating his greatness, only to have him publicly humiliate you and destroy everything you've created. That's exactly what happened. The Emperor personally traveled to Lorgar's greatest triumph, the cathedral city of Monarchia, a gleaming testament to faith and devotion, and ordered it destroyed. Not conquered, not occupied, but completely obliterated. Fire and ash rained from the sky as the Emperor's forces systematically demolished every temple, every shrine, every carefully crafted symbol of Lorgar's love and devotion. Then, in front of Lorgar's entire legion, the Emperor forced them all to kneel in the ruins while he delivered a crushing rebuke that echoed across the galaxy. The message was clear: faith was weakness, worship was forbidden, and Lorgar's greatest achievements were not just wrong but shameful. Lorgar was shattered. He had loved the Emperor more deeply and purely than perhaps any of his brothers, and now he felt not just rejected but mocked, his deepest convictions dismissed as the fantasies of a fool. In his sorrow and confusion, he became vulnerable to whispers from the warp. Whispers that told him he had been right about divinity, just wrong about which gods deserved worship. The dark gods of chaos promised him something the Emperor never had. They welcomed his devotion. They told him that the divine was real and powerful, just not in the form he had expected. They showed him that if the Emperor refused to accept worship, perhaps he was unworthy of it. Perhaps someone else, or something else, deserved to be elevated instead. Lorgar fell into their trap completely, but his corruption was gradual and insidious. He turned away from the Emperor and began secretly worshipping the gods of chaos. But he didn't stop there. His genius for organization and inspiration, previously devoted to spreading the imperial truth, now served darker masters. He became their prophet and primary evangelist, quietly spreading their teachings to his brothers and carefully orchestrating many of the events that would eventually lead to the Horus Heresy. Where other Primarchs fell to chaos through violence or desperation, Lorgar's fall was the result of pure heartbreak and the slow, methodical unraveling of his faith. He didn't want power or revenge, he just wanted his faith to matter, to mean something to someone. When the Emperor rejected that faith, Lorgar turned to those who would not just welcome it, but reward it, no matter how dark and terrible they might be. The bitter irony is that Lorgar was ultimately proven right. The Emperor was indeed divine, or at least became so through the worship of trillions of humans across the galaxy. But by the time this became clear, Lorgar had already chosen different gods to serve, and there was no path back to the light. If Horus's story is one of love turned to betrayal, and Lorgar's is one of rejected faith, then Angren's story is one of the most pure and tragic of all the fallen Primarchs. It's the story of a slave who was never truly freed, a gladiator who never stopped fighting for his life, and a son who never forgave his father for saving him. Angren didn't grow up in a palace like Fulgrim or command respect from childhood like Horus. He was born into slavery on one of the most brutal worlds in the galaxy, a place where human life was cheaper than ammunition and children were raised like livestock for slaughter. As a young boy, he was forced into gladiator arenas and made to fight other children to the death for the entertainment of alien masters who viewed human suffering as the highest form of art. To make their entertainment even more spectacular, his captors implanted crude neural devices called the Butcher's Nails into his brain. These archaeotech horrors were designed with one purpose: to punish him with excruciating pain unless he was constantly angry, constantly violent, constantly ready to kill. The nails didn't just encourage aggression, They made peace physically unbearable. Calm moments became torture sessions. Quiet reflection became agony. Love, friendship, and joy were gradually burned out of his mind, replaced by an endless need for violence and blood. But even under these impossible conditions, Angren's nobility shone through. He didn't just survive, he inspired others to resist. He became a leader among the slaves, a symbol of defiance against impossible odds. Eventually, he managed to organize and lead a massive slave rebellion, fighting for freedom with every ounce of rage and determination he possessed. For the first time in his life, he was fighting not for the entertainment of masters, but for something that mattered, the liberation of his people. He was winning. Against all odds, the rebellion was actually succeeding. Angren stood with his chosen family, his fellow gladiators, his brothers and sisters in chains who had become closer to him than blood relatives, on the blood-soaked sands of what would be their final battle against their oppressors. Victory was within reach, freedom was possible, and then the Emperor arrived. But instead of helping finish the fight, instead of lending his godlike power to a righteous cause, the Emperor made a choice that would forever poison his relationship with his found son. He teleported Angren away from the battlefield at the last second, saving only him while leaving all his fellow rebels to be slaughtered by their vengeful masters. The Emperor's reasoning was coldly practical. Angren was valuable, a Primarch whose power could serve the Great Crusade. The other slaves were expendable casualties in a larger war. But to Angren, this was the ultimate betrayal. Imagine the person who claims to be your father showing up during your greatest moment of heroism and saving only you, abandoning your chosen family to die for the crime of fighting alongside you. That betrayal burned in Angren's soul forever, made worse by the constant pain of the butcher's nails, which continued to pound agony into his skull every moment he wasn't killing something. The Emperor never tried to remove the nails, never acknowledged the injustice of what had happened, never even seemed to understand why Angren was angry about being rescued from his greatest victory. Where other Primarchs served the Emperor out of love, duty, or ambition, Angren served only because he had no choice, and his service was punctuated by barely contained rage and resentment. He never cared about the grand politics of the Great Crusade or the Emperor's vision for unified humanity. All he cared about was the rage that consumed him, the pain that never stopped, and the memory of the family he had been forced to abandon. So when Horus came to him and offered a chance to destroy the Emperor, not for ideology or grand strategy, but simply for revenge, Angren didn't hesitate. He joined the rebellion not because he believed in chaos or wanted to see the galaxy burn, but because he wanted the one man responsible for his greatest pain to suffer as he had suffered. In battle, Angren became something beyond mortal comprehension, a hurricane of fury, a living avatar of rage that could tear through enemy formations like they were made of paper. But unlike his brothers who found glory or satisfaction in combat, Angren found only more pain. Every victory was empty because it couldn't bring back his dead gladiator family. Every enemy he killed was just another distraction from the agony that never ended. He was a warrior whose heart had been ripped out long before he ever turned traitor, fighting not for any cause, but simply because fighting was the only thing that made the pain bearable, even for a moment. Where Angren represented pure, honest rage, Fulgrim embodied something far more insidious and complex. The corruption that comes not from obvious evil, but from the pursuit of seemingly noble ideals taken to their logical extreme. If Angren was a warrior who had been broken by brutality, Fulgrim was an artist who had been destroyed by his own impossible standards. Fulgrim was, by any measure, a shining star among the Primarchs. Handsome beyond mortal comprehension, eloquent enough to make angels weep, and artistically gifted to a degree that shamed the greatest masters of human history, he was also unbelievably skilled in every form of combat and leadership. But more than any of these individual talents, Fulgrim was obsessed with a single consuming ideal: perfection. Everything he did, from painting a portrait to delivering a speech to dueling with a sword, had to be absolutely flawless. Not just good, not just excellent, but perfect in every conceivable way. His legion, the Emperor's children, followed his example with fanatical devotion, seeking excellence in every aspect of their lives. They were warriors who fought like artists, artists who created like philosophers, and philosophers who thought like warriors. At first, this drive for perfection was genuinely inspiring. Fulgrim believed that beauty and excellence could uplift not just himself, but all of humanity. He envisioned a future where every human being could achieve their highest potential, where art and war could be united in sublime harmony, where the galaxy itself could become a masterpiece worthy of the Emperor's vision. But perfection is a trap that has destroyed greater minds than Fulgrim's. No one can ever truly reach it. There is always another level of excellence to achieve, another flaw to eliminate, another standard to surpass. What begins as inspiration gradually becomes obsession, and obsession eventually becomes madness. The first crack in Fulgrim's psyche came not from failure, but from success. As he achieved greater and greater heights of skill and beauty, he found that each victory felt less satisfying than the last. Excellence became routine. Mastery became boring. He needed greater challenges, more extreme experiences, more intense sensations to feel truly alive. On a forgotten world during a routine compliance action, Fulgrim discovered what seemed like a gift from the Emperor himself, an ancient sword of incredible beauty and power. The weapon was gorgeous beyond description, its blade seeming to capture and reflect light in impossible ways, its edge sharp enough to cut through reality itself. When he held it, Fulgrim felt complete for the first time in decades. What he didn't know was that the sword housed a demon of Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess, pleasure, and the pursuit of perfection taken to its ultimate extreme. The demon was patient and subtle, whispering to Fulgrim day and night, filling his thoughts with carefully crafted suggestions that seemed to come from his own mind. The demon told him he was already perfect, more than perfect, really. It suggested that his brothers were jealous of his achievements, that the Emperor himself feared Fulgrim's potential to surpass him, that the limits he accepted were not natural laws but artificial constraints imposed by lesser beings who couldn't understand true greatness. And slowly, inexorably, Fulgrim listened. He began to change, but so gradually that neither he nor his followers noticed the transformation at first. What had started as a healthy pursuit of beauty and excellence turned into an unhealthy spiral of indulgence and sensation-seeking. Art became an excuse for depravity. Perfection became an excuse for cruelty. The pursuit of the sublime became a justification for the obscene. Fulgrim surrounded himself with luxury and pleasure, but no amount of sensation was ever enough. He needed stronger experiences, more intense stimulation, more extreme forms of beauty and horror to feel anything at all. His art became increasingly disturbing, his behavior more erratic, his standards more impossible to meet. The final step in his corruption came when, fully possessed by the demon, he murdered his closest friend and brother-in-arms in a moment of supernatural fury, and barely felt any guilt about it afterward. The diamond had convinced him that such feelings were weaknesses, obstacles to the perfection he sought. When Horus invited Fulgrim to join the rebellion, the idea of following rules or serving anyone else seemed laughable. Why should perfection itself bow to inferior beings? Chaos promised Fulgrim the chance to explore every desire, every sensation, every possible height of experience without limit or consequence. He became a prince of decadence, radiant and terrible on the outside, utterly corrupted within. The tragedy of Fulgrim is that he achieved exactly what he always claimed to want: perfection. But the perfection he found was not the noble ideal he had originally pursued. It was the perfect embodiment of everything he had once sought to transcend. If Fulgrim's fall came from the corruption of noble ideals, then Perturabo's fall came from something far more mundane and relatable: the slow, grinding resentment that builds up when someone's contributions are consistently overlooked and undervalued. His story is not one of dramatic corruption or supernatural influence, but of a brilliant mind gradually poisoned by bitterness and neglect. Perturabo wasn't flashy like Fulgrim or charismatic like Horus. He didn't inspire religious devotion like Lorgar or command through fear like Angron. Instead, he was a master of logic, mathematics, and engineering, the kind of genius who could design fortresses that would take millennia to breach, weapons that could destroy entire cities with surgical precision, and siege engines that turned impossible military problems into simple mathematical equations. In a perfect world, Perturabo would have been celebrated as one of the greatest architects and engineers in human history. His mind was capable of visualizing and creating wonders that would have made the ancient builders of Terra weep with envy. He could have built paradise itself, given the chance and the recognition he deserved. But the Great Crusade wasn't interested in paradise. It was interested in conquest, and conquest meant that someone had to do the dirty work. That someone was always Perturabo. While his brothers basked in the glory of rapid victories and decisive battles, Perturabo was given the thankless assignments that nobody else wanted: the endless sieges that took years to complete, the slow, grinding campaigns against heavily fortified worlds, the defensive actions that prevented disasters but never made headlines. He was the Primarch you called when the job was impossible, the situation was hopeless, and success would be measured not in glory but in grim survival. And he succeeded, every single time. Perturabo never failed a mission, never lost a siege, never left a job half-finished. His Iron Warriors became legendary for their ability to break any defense and hold any position, no matter the cost. Where other legions might falter or retreat, the Iron Warriors endured. But endurance doesn't win you parades. Competence doesn't earn you love. Success in terrible circumstances doesn't get you the recognition that success in glorious circumstances does. The worst part? Nobody ever said, "Thank you." Not the Emperor, who simply assigned him the next impossible task without comment. Not his brothers, who were happy to let him handle the situations they found too boring or too difficult. Not even the people he saved, who rarely knew that Perturabo's unglamorous work had prevented their worlds from falling to enemy forces. They treated him like a tool, reliable, effective, and utterly replaceable. This neglect built up over years and decades like water slowly eroding stone. What started as disappointment became frustration. Frustration became anger. Anger became bitter resentment. And resentment, left untreated, becomes a poison that corrupts everything it touches. Perturabo began to see patterns everywhere he looked. Patterns of favoritism, of deliberate insult, of systematic disrespect. He noticed that other Primarchs received praise for achievements that paled in comparison to his own daily accomplishments. He saw that flashy victories were celebrated while essential but unglamorous successes were ignored. He realized that his father and brothers valued spectacle over substance, style over engineering, excellence. When Horus approached him with an offer to join the rebellion, Perturabo didn't hesitate for a moment. Here, finally, was someone who recognized his worth, who understood his value, who offered him the respect and acknowledgement he had been denied for so long. Horus didn't just want his military skills, he wanted Perturabo himself, as a brother and an equal. For the first time in decades, Perturabo felt valued. In the Horus Heresy, Perturabo unleashed all the genius and creativity that had been constrained by thankless duty and unrecognized service. But instead of building paradise, he built hell. His fortresses became prisons for loyalist forces. His defensive positions became launching points for devastating attacks. His machines of construction became engines of destruction. The builder had become a breaker, and no wall in the galaxy could hold back the fury of a genius who had finally decided to show the universe exactly what he was capable of when he stopped caring about serving others and started focusing on serving himself. The tragedy of Perturabo is that all he ever really wanted was recognition, not worship like Lorgar, not love like Horus, just simple acknowledgement that his contributions mattered. If the Emperor had just once said, "Thank you," or "Well done," if his brothers had occasionally recognized his sacrifices, if anyone had treated him as more than a useful tool, the galaxy might have been a very different place. Instead, one of the greatest builders in human history became one of its most destructive forces, all for one-of-a-kind word. If there's one Primarch whose story sends chills down your spine and makes you question the very nature of justice and morality, it's Konrad Curze, also known as the Night Haunter. His tale is not one of corruption or betrayal in the traditional sense, but something far more disturbing, the story of someone who was probably doomed from the moment he drew breath, trapped by visions of a future he couldn't change, and a nature he couldn't escape. Konrad was born into a world that was essentially hell, with a different name, a planet drowning in darkness, crime, and moral decay. Picture Gotham City at its absolute worst, but instead of having any hope of redemption, it was a place where murderers, thieves, and monsters had completely taken over every aspect of society. The weak existed only to be preyed upon by the strong, and the strong existed only to prey upon each other in an endless cycle of violence and degradation. Young Konrad survived in this nightmare by hiding in the shadows and hunting the wicked, but his methods of justice were extreme. He didn't arrest criminals or try to rehabilitate them. He became something far more primal and terrifying. He was a vigilante who stalked through the night, dishing out brutal final justice to those who had escaped all other forms of punishment. He didn't just kill the guilty, he made them suffer first. He flayed them alive to teach lessons about the pain they had inflicted on others. He displayed their bodies in gruesome tableaux designed to strike terror into the hearts of anyone who might consider following their example. People began to whisper about the Night Haunter, a ghost who punished evil with methods so terrible that even the worst criminals began to fear the darkness. And it worked. Crime rates plummeted not out of moral improvement, but out of pure terror. Konrad had created peace through fear, order through horror, justice through methods that would have made hardened executioners sick to their stomachs. But Konrad wasn't just a brutal vigilante. He was cursed with something that made his existence infinitely more tragic. He possessed the gift, or curse, of prophetic visions, but these weren't visions of hope or possibility. Instead, he saw only the worst possible futures. He witnessed cities burning in nuclear fire. He watched his brothers killing each other in civil war. He saw the Emperor's death and the collapse of everything they were trying to build. Most tragically of all, he believed with absolute certainty that everything he saw was unavoidable destiny rather than mere possibility. This belief in predestination poisoned every aspect of Konrad's existence. If the future was fixed, then nothing he did really mattered. If his brothers were destined to betray each other, then there was no point in trying to prevent it. If the Emperor was fated to die, then loyalty was just a meaningless gesture. If he himself was destined to become a monster, then he might as well embrace that role completely. So he did exactly that. When the Emperor found him, Konrad was already feared and hated by the very people he had saved through terror. They were grateful for the peace he had brought, but they were also terrified of the methods he had used to achieve it. The Emperor welcomed him into the fold as he did all his sons, but he never truly understood Conrad's unique psychology or the visions that tormented him. Conrad didn't believe in hope or redemption or the possibility of genuine improvement. He believed that peace could only come through control, and control could only be maintained through terror. In his broken worldview, fear was the only honest emotion, violence was the only reliable solution, and darkness was the only truth worth acknowledging. Over time, his visions and his madness grew worse, feeding off each other in an endless spiral of despair and violence. When he saw the future betrayal of the Emperor and the civil war that would tear the galaxy apart, he took it not as a warning to be heeded but as destiny to be fulfilled. In his fractured mind, he believed he was still doing the right thing, punishing a corrupt galaxy the only way he knew how. When Conrad joined Horus in rebellion, it wasn't because he hated his father or believed in chaos, it was because he saw no other path available to him. His visions had shown him the future, and he believed he was simply playing his assigned role in a cosmic tragedy that had been written long before any of them were born. The most chilling aspect of Conrad's story is that he was probably right about many of his visions. The Civil War did come, the Emperor was mortally wounded, and the galaxy did burn. But whether these events were inevitable destiny or self-fulfilling prophecy remains an open question that haunts everyone who knows his story. Conrad Kurz represents the ultimate nightmare scenario. What happens when someone with the power to change the world becomes convinced that change is impossible? His fall wasn't a betrayal of his principles. It was the logical conclusion of a philosophy that saw darkness as the only truth and violence as the only solution. Where Conrad Kurz was driven by visions of an unchangeable future, Mortarion was shaped by memories of an unbearable past. His story is one of endurance, resentment, and the slow corruption that comes when someone's greatest strength becomes their greatest weakness. It's the tale of a liberator who was never allowed to complete his liberation, a survivor who was never permitted to truly live. Mortarion was raised on a world that was literally poisonous to human life. His adoptive planet was choked by toxic mists that could kill an ordinary person in minutes, ruled by inhuman overlords who used chemical weapons and environmental warfare to keep their human slaves in line. The air itself was a weapon, every breath a potential death sentence, every day a struggle just to keep functioning in an environment designed to destroy human life. But Mortarion survived, and more than survived, he thrived. His unique physiology allowed him to endure toxins that would have killed his brothers, to fight in conditions that would have been impossible for any other Primarch. He developed an almost supernatural resistance to poison, disease, and environmental hazards. Where others would have died, Mortarion grew stronger. Growing up in this hellscape taught him lessons that would define his entire worldview. He learned that life was suffering, that the strong preyed upon the weak, that survival required constant vigilance and endless endurance. But he also learned something else, that even the most oppressive system could be overthrown if someone was willing to pay the price in blood and pain. So he fought back. Mortarion rallied the human population, teaching them to survive in the poisonous environment that their overlords had created. He showed them how to endure what couldn't be avoided and how to strike back against what could be changed. Slowly, painfully, at tremendous cost in lives and suffering, he built a resistance movement that actually had a chance of succeeding. The rebellion was brutal, grinding, and utterly without glory. There were no grand battles or heroic charges, just endless guerrilla warfare in toxic wasteland, ambushes in poisonous fog, and the slow, methodical elimination of an enemy that had seemed invincible. Mortarion and his followers bled for every victory, paid in agony for every step forward, endured unimaginable suffering for the sake of eventual freedom. And they were winning. Against all odds, despite the impossible conditions and overwhelming enemy advantages, Mortarion's rebellion was actually on the verge of success. He was about to achieve the liberation he had dreamed of since childhood, about to prove that no tyrant was too powerful to be overthrown, about to free his people through his own strength and determination. And then the Emperor arrived and killed Mortarion's final enemy with a single, casual blow. To everyone else, this looked like salvation. The Emperor had ended the war instantly, achieving in seconds what Mortarion had been struggling toward for years. But to Mortarion, it was the ultimate humiliation and theft. He had trained for this moment, bled for it, sacrificed everything for the chance to personally strike down the monster who had tormented his people. The victory should have been his, earned through suffering and perseverance. Instead, the Emperor had simply stepped in at the last moment and claimed credit for a war he hadn't fought, a struggle he hadn't endured, a victory he hadn't earned. From that moment on, Mortarion resented his father with a cold, bitter hatred that never faded or diminished. He saw the Emperor not as a savior or a leader, but as a cheat, someone who wanted obedience and gratitude without having to earn them through genuine struggle. The Emperor had power, but he had never truly suffered. He could command armies, but he had never endured the kind of grinding, hopeless battle that Mortarion had lived through. This resentment colored every aspect of Mortarion's service to the Imperium. He obeyed orders because he had to, but he never forgot that his greatest moment had been stolen from him. He endured because endurance was what he did best, but he never found joy or satisfaction in his victories because they reminded him of the one victory he had been denied. Years later, when Mortarion was approached by Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, decay, and endurance, the corruption was so gradual and natural that it almost seemed inevitable. Nurgle didn't promise glory or power. Instead, he offered something far more seductive to Mortarion's particular psychology. He promised endurance without suffering, strength through acceptance of decay, and the ultimate victory over death itself. Nurgle understood what the Emperor never had, that Mortarion's greatest strength was his ability to endure anything, and his greatest weakness was his need for that endurance to mean something, to serve a purpose greater than mere survival. Mortarion's transformation from a bitter but loyal Primarch into a walking Plague Lord was slow, methodical, and utterly irreversible. He didn't seek beauty like Fulgrim, or recognition like Perturabo. He sought only the strength to endure a universe he saw as fundamentally hostile and meaningless. His fall was the quiet corruption of someone who had already given up hope long before chaos ever touched him, someone who had been slowly dying inside since the day his father robbed him of his one chance at meaningful victory. If the other Traitor Primarchs fell through emotional wounds or character flaws, Magnus the Red fell through hubris and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. His was perhaps the most tragic corruption of all, for it stemmed not from weakness but from what he perceived as his greatest strength. Where Angren was consumed by rage born of the butcher's nails, where Perturabo festered with jealousy and resentment at being overlooked, where Fulgrim was seduced by his own vanity and the promise of perfection, Magnus the Red believed himself above such base human frailties. The Crimson King, master of the Thousand Sons Legion and perhaps the most psychically gifted of all the Primarchs, saw himself as the ultimate scholar warrior, a being of pure intellect who could unravel the universe's deepest mysteries through reason and will alone. His insatiable hunger for understanding knew no bounds. His confidence in his own abilities was absolute, and his belief that knowledge, any knowledge, no matter how forbidden, could be wielded safely was unshakable. This intellectual arrogance became his fatal flaw, for Magnus refused to acknowledge that there were some doors in the universe that should never be opened, some truths too dangerous to know, some powers too corrupt to touch. Even when the Emperor himself, the most powerful psyker in human history, warned against delving too deeply into the warp's mysteries, Magnus dismissed these concerns as the fearful ignorance of lesser minds. He saw the Council of Nicaea's prohibition against sorcery not as wisdom born from terrible experience, but as a shackling of humanity's greatest evolutionary step, a betrayal of their psychic potential by those too weak or blind to understand it. When the moment came to warn his father of Horus's treachery, Magnus chose the one method he knew would pierce through any defense instantly, a psychic message of such raw power that it tore through the Emperor's carefully constructed barriers around Terra like a hurricane through paper. In that single, catastrophic moment of well-intentioned urgency, Magnus shattered not just his father's psychic shields, but the Webway project itself, humanity's salvation from the perils of warp travel, the golden road that would have freed mankind from the predations of chaos forever. The greatest tragedy was that Magnus genuinely believed he was saving his father's dream, when in truth he had become the unwitting instrument of its absolute destruction, proving that in the grim darkness of the far future, the most dangerous enemy is not malice or hatred, but good intentions wielded by an arrogant hand that refuses to acknowledge its own limitations. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe, and you also might enjoy watching these. Thanks.